Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this session on new terrorism threats and counterterrorism strategies. I'm Liz Rosenberg. I direct the Energy, Economics, and Security Program at the Center for New American Security. And on behalf of CNAS, excuse me, and our partners at the New York University Center on Law and Security, we're very happy to have you here today. In today's program, we're going to focus on particularly new and emerging terrorism threats, including trends in online radicalization, in the flows of foreign fighters, and in the role of new financial technology and virtual currency and terrorist financing. And the latter is a subject that we've been looking at quite extensively at CNAS and CLS in the last year. We're also going to look at new strategies or new approaches from the new U.S. administration and have a chance to hear from the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, Nicholas Rasmussen. We'll begin with a keynote from Director Rasmussen, followed by a question and answer session with him. And then we'll move directly into an expert panel chaired by my colleague and collaborator, Zach Goldman of NYU. So a few notes before we begin. We are recording this session. It's on the record. We'll archive it on the CNAS and CLS website. If you can, please silence your cell phones so we will be uninterrupted. And I wanted to briefly note that today we're releasing a report. Here it is. You may have seen it when you came in, on terrorist financing and virtual currencies, some of the themes of which we'll pick up in today's session. So now let me just quickly introduce our keynote speaker. The Honorable Nick Rasmussen has a distinguished career in government in a variety of counterterrorism roles, working under Democratic and Republican administrations. He's served as the director of NCTC since December 2014, and prior to that, as its assistant director for 2.5 years. For 5 years prior to that, he served with the National Security Council staff as special assistant to the president and senior director for counterterrorism, where he was responsible for providing staff support to the president, the national security advisor, and Homeland Security advisor on counterterrorism policy and strategy. His full bio is available in the program materials you may have picked up when you came in. And now we'll turn to Director Rasmussen. The floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Liz. Yeah. And thank you to both CNAS and to NYU for the opportunity to join you today. I like the juxtaposition, the keynote and then the expert panel. So there's the kind of the sense that once I've said my thing, we'll bring in some smart people who may actually know a thing or two about counterterrorism. So, but it's also good to look around the room and see so many friends, former colleagues, longtime friends and colleagues. So it really is my honor to be here today. I get the chance a lot, or quite often, to talk in public about the threat landscape that we face these days, and I typically describe it as being more challenging and diverse and complicated than ever before. And I would suggest that as we get together here today in this auditorium, the discipline of terrorism prevention is literally evolving and changing beneath our feet every day, and it requires that we respond with extraordinary agility and extraordinary flexibility. I think it's fair to say, and I think because I've been around the counterterrorism community for a while now, I think I can say with some credibility that the counterterrorism work that we were doing 10 years ago or even 5 years ago looks very different from the counterterrorism work that we are doing today. And I'm fairly certain that if the future holds an even more complicated story to tell on counterterrorism, if I was to do this same event with you in a year's time or 2 years' time, we'd be dealing with some new variant of a CT threat. So I want to take the opportunity this morning to quickly discuss 3 topics. First, I'll start with just some thoughts on the terrorism threat landscape that we see from ISIS and al-Qaeda. Secondly, I'll say a few words about some areas where I think we can do a better job of tackling the threat of those who are mobilized to extremist violence here in the United States and around the world. And lastly, I'll finish with just a few quick words on CT strategy, understanding that that's the bulk of how you'll spend your time today. So let's start with the overall threat. And one doesn't have to look very far or very hard to see how the ISIS threat is manifesting itself in almost every Western nation. And that includes in areas well beyond the conflict zone in the Middle East and far removed from the physical caliphate in Iraq and Syria. And that threat continues to take multiple forms. And in broadly general terms, the threat we collectively face, all of us, falls along a spectrum that ranges from inspired attacks on one end of the spectrum to enabled attacks somewhere in the middle of that spectrum, and then finishing up with directed attacks on the far end of that spectrum. And again, at this one end, we have inspired attacks. We think of an attack as inspired by a foreign terrorist organization when an individual or cell carries out an operation on a group's behalf or in its name but without any direct support from that group or without any direct engagement or direct contact with that foreign terrorist organization. Now, at the other end of that spectrum, we have directed attacks, and those are the ones that are easy to describe because they're the ones we are traditionally used to. A directed attack occurs when a group provides support to all or nearly all facets of an attack. They help train, they help target, they help select the operatives, they deploy the resources necessary to get an attack underway. Now, often in the ISIS world that we're living in now, we see individuals operate between these two extremes of inspired and directed in what I would characterize as the messy middle of enabled attacks. And these enabled attacks are characterized by varying degrees of support that a group like ISIS might support or might provide to an individual or a cell carrying out an attack. A group might provide an attacker with technical guidance or some form of material support, but the group falls well short of actually guiding or controlling the terrorist actor. And this changing landscape, the emergence of this messy middle that I just described, has made our efforts to analyze and anticipate the threat that we face more difficult than ever, and not just for the US, but for our partners around the world as well. And while progress has certainly been made in shrinking the size of the territory that ISIS controls in Iraq and Syria, we also know that the group maintains the ability to carry out attacks, as I described earlier, far beyond the conflict zone. And the number of arrests and other disruptions we've seen and we read about every day in the newspaper around the globe, while those are effective testament to great intelligence and law enforcement work, it also tells us that the global reach of ISIS right now is largely intact despite the extremely effective work that has been done to degrade ISIS in its caliphate. The group also continues to publish thousands of pieces of official propaganda and to use online mobile applications to organize supporters and inspire attacks. All of this underscores our belief in the intelligence community that there is not, in fact, a direct link between ISIS's battlefield position in Iraq and Syria and the group's capacity to carry out external attacks. And it makes clear that battlefield losses alone will be insufficient to mitigate the threat that we all feel from ISIS. Winning on the battlefield in places like Mosul and Iraq is a necessary but insufficient step in the process of eliminating the ISIS threat to U.S. interests around the world. And so we need to be patient in terms of expecting return on the investment that we are making with the campaign against ISIS. It's simply going to take longer than we would like to translate victory on the battlefield into a genuine reduction in threat to our citizens. Now, a separate question that continually comes up whenever I talk about ISIS or whenever my analysts are in a setting talking about ISIS is the question of foreign fighters and what will happen with that to the thousands of foreign fighters who travel to the conflict zone. What will happen to them when coalition pressure inside Iraq and Syria continues to shrink the size of the caliphate? And at this point in the conflict, we are facing a challenge of approximately 40,000 foreign terrorist fighters who have traveled from at least 120 countries over the last 4 years to get to the conflict zone. Now, the good news is, and it is good news, the good news is that we know that this rate of foreign fighter traveling to the conflict zone has steadily declined since its peak in 2014. Now, in terms of outflows from the conflict zone, we expect that the numbers of foreign fighters attempting to leave Syria and Iraq, they will increase as ISIS continues to lose territory, and that seems natural and certainly to be expected. That said, I think we're unlikely to see a mass exodus, as we actually expect in the intelligence community that many of the battle-hardened fighters who worked so hard to get to Iraq and Syria will actually stay there and look to fight on behalf of the caliphate. But we are concerned about a small minority of fighters who will return or who will try to return to their home countries looking to build local networks and plot attacks. And given the size and scope of the problem I'm describing, even that small minority will test our ability to prevent extremists from traveling abroad to carry out potential attacks. Volume was initially our chief concern. We were worried about being overwhelmed by this reverse foreign fighter flow at the point when the conflict began to resolve itself. But I think we've come to realize that it's actually quality that matters as much or more than quantity when it comes to foreign fighters who are returning home. Individuals who may return to their points of origin with specialized skills or a unique capacity to mobilize other extremists, they can pose a significant threat, even if the numbers are less than we may have envisioned when we talked about foreign fighter flow a few years ago. Now, here in the U.S., we certainly recognize that it's partner nations abroad who are going to do much of the heavy lifting with respect to the foreign fighter problem. And that's because the U.S. persons make up a very small portion of the total number of foreign fighters, number of people who have traveled to Iraq and Syria to participate in the conflict. But even if that volume is relatively small, it falls upon us to remain vigilant in identifying and tracking those individuals to mitigate the threat that they could pose here in the homeland. It's also worth me saying in this forum, as focused as we are on addressing the challenge that ISIS presents, it's also worth me highlighting that al-Qaeda has never stopped being a primary counterterrorism concern for the United States, and certainly not for the CT community, of which I'm a part. In fact, I think it's fair to say that not a single day has gone by during my entire tenure, both at NCTC and in other senior jobs I've held in the counterterrorism community. Not a single day has gone by during that tenure where our emphasis on al-Qaeda has been on anything less than a top priority. That is obviously the beauty of working on terrorism issues. You get the privilege of having multiple top priorities at any one time to focus your attention on. And as a result, I would argue that our resources are stretched across the globe to make sure that we don't miss a critical piece of intelligence or we don't miss an opportunity to mitigate or disrupt a potential terrorist threat. Now, in this resource-constrained environment, understanding the al-Qaeda threat and the threat that al-Qaeda continues to represent requires significant analytic effort at a place like NCTC and across our intelligence community. And I find sometimes that with all the focus on ISIS, I need to explain sometimes in public a little more about why we're still so concerned about al-Qaeda. There's no doubt but that CT pressure in the last decade has significantly degraded al-Qaeda's leadership and its cadre in Afghanistan and Pakistan. That's certainly the good news part of the story. But because of this pressure, al-Qaeda has shifted from its traditional Pakistan-based leadership structure that relied on a centralized shura. It has shifted to make decisions to a more geographically dispersed network, a network of affiliates and of veteran al-Qaeda leaders who have spread out in various parts of the world. And this larger al-Qaeda network has also evolved and proven resilient despite a range of setbacks. The setbacks include losses of multiple senior leaders and the fact that ISIS has stepped up as an ideological rival. Now, this al-Qaeda global network that I'm talking about includes 5 official affiliates. And it's worth noting that despite the rise of ISIS, none of these al-Qaeda affiliates has actually defected formally to join ISIS's caliphate since ISIS formally broke from al-Qaeda in 2013. Think about that for a moment. That's the mark of a resilient organization. And even as ISIS has seized control of the global terrorism stage, the various al-Qaeda groups have also managed in their own way to sustain recruitment, to build on local relationships, and to derive sufficient resources in their environments to maintain their operations. So again, ISIS dominates the headlines, but we in the counterterrorism community see this evolution of al-Qaeda as evidence of a strikingly resilient and capable organization. That worries me, and I would argue it should worry all of you as well. Now, as I wrap up this overview of the threat environment, I'll talk quickly about what I see as the most immediate threat here in the United States, and that is homegrown violent extremism, the HVE phenomenon as we refer to it. I've outlined the dynamic threat environment we face from ISIS and al-Qaeda and their global networks, but it's here in the United States, here at home, that homegrown violent extremists present the most immediate and unpredictable threat that we face. On any given day, if God forbid we were to suffer an attack here, my first thought, before we may have had any hard information, would be that an HVE was likely responsible. And we've seen a dramatic increase in the pool of potential HVEs, homegrown violent extremists. And the FBI, as everybody in this audience is likely aware, is in some stage of investigating at least 1,000 potential HVEs across all 50 states. Now, in the past, we've seen that ideology played an important role in radicalization and in helping small groups of terrorists maintain their cohesiveness. Today, however, we believe that this current generation of HVEs probably has a much more limited knowledge of extremist ideology when compared to the generation of extremists we were dealing with in the early 2000s. Many HVEs, we believe, now gravitate toward the violence and adventure of fighting rather than absorbing the nuances of jihadist ideology as a rationale for their violence. We've also had to acknowledge that there are a number of factors at play when an individual ultimately becomes a terrorist, that these factors are often highly individualized, and that there probably aren't simple antidotes or vaccinations that can be applied at scale across our large population here in the United States. It's clearly much more complicated than that. Now, given the threats we face, I'll talk quickly about some of the strategies we're using to counter them. Now, one of the things, and I'll start in the intelligence field where I have direct responsibility. One of the things we do in the intelligence field that we do really, really well and are always continuing to improve and build upon is collecting intelligence and sharing it with those who need it to arm them and enable them to prevent terrorists from succeeding. And I think it's fair to say we continue to be very aggressive and creative in collecting intelligence and using every available tool. We also share intelligence across our national security organizations in a very structured way, and our willingness and capacity to share intelligence with partners overseas, that continues to expand rapidly. We collect more, we share more, and we do that more rapidly and with fewer impediments than any of us in the intelligence world would have thought possible 15 years ago. We also do more to share that intelligence outside the federal government with the full array of state, municipal, and local law enforcement professionals who end up being the first line of defense here in the homeland. Not a day goes by where there isn't some sort of substantive exchange of terrorism information between NCTC, FBI, DHS with our non-federal partners. Just this week, I spent time with LAPD, Los Angeles Police Department, and the FBI in Los Angeles talking about just this sort of sharing and how much we continue to break new ground in this area. Because of this level of information sharing, it's my view that we still hold the upper hand over our terrorist adversaries, even as the challenge of collecting the right intelligence gets harder and harder every year. We certainly know that al-Qaeda and ISIS continue to aspire to carry out significant attacks on U.S. soil, but they are challenged to do so. The very fact that both of these groups continue to call upon lone actors to commit isolated acts of violence, that speaks to the difficulty that they perceive they are having in mobilizing a more consequential, a larger-sized attack. Now, given the group's reliance on radicalizing individuals in the way I just described here in the United States, I'll say a quick few words about what the U.S. government is doing to counter violent extremism. Now, as a federal government, we've taken steps to organize and resource our efforts to counter violent extremism more effectively. And my own view is that we've been successful in some very specific cases at helping provide communities with information and tools they need to identify potential extremists and to engage with them before they reach the point of actually becoming a threat to the community. This kind of engagement can hopefully provide the off-ramp that takes an individual off that pathway to becoming a potential terrorist. We at NCTC do this mainly through a series of community awareness briefings that we produce and present in cooperation with partners at the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI. The briefing raises awareness about violent extremist recruitment techniques, and it gives communities the tools to recognize the signs of radicalization and to catalyze or stimulate an intervention that would prevent an individual from reaching the point of committing a crime. At NCTC, we've also organized and facilitated various community resilience exercises in communities around the country. This is a tabletop exercise that literally brings together community leaders and law enforcement partners around a table to talk through how they might game out a response to a particular terrorism problem in their local community. It allows them to develop an action plan. What would work in their community? What tools do they need to develop in their community? This is all good work, work that my NCTC colleagues and I are doing, and I'm very proud of the work that my colleagues are doing in this area. But the reality is we have to do more. The scale at which we undertake these efforts here in the homeland, I would argue, is still too limited. And it's certainly not sized to tackle the kind of problem that we are seeing here in the homeland today. And we do know this. These countering violent extremism activities do have positive impacts in places where we have tried it, even if it's difficult to measure that impact with outputs like traditional metrics. How exactly do you prove that you have dissuaded someone from going down a radical or extremist path? It's very hard to do. But in my view, these countering violent extremism activities expand the counterterrorism toolkit. They expand the toolkit beyond the hard power tools, and to my mind, that is clearly a good thing. I'll wrap up with just one or two quick thoughts on counterterrorism strategies, because after all, that's a good chunk of what you were planning to talk about today. Forums such as this one help us all better understand our strengths and capabilities, but also helpfully our weaknesses and our vulnerabilities. And that's important as we think about CT strategy. Though we are dealing with a more challenging threat environment than ever before, I would also argue that we are also doing more and doing it better than we ever have done before to keep citizens safe and secure. I really do believe that we are getting better at counterterrorism work and getting better at the prevention part of what we're doing. But on the question of broader CT strategy and how we define our long-term strategic objectives, I'll just leave you with one thought. And as I look back on my efforts to help develop CT strategies, counterterrorism strategies, from my time in the Bush administration White House, the Obama administration White House, and today as part of President Trump's administration, the lesson learned that I take away from my involvement is simply this. We should all bring a good amount of humility to the project of developing CT strategies that touch on conflict zones like Iraq and Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, the Sahel region of North Africa. I say that about humility because as powerful and as capable as the United States is, and it's certainly true that we have military, law enforcement, and intelligence capabilities that surpass those of any nation on earth, it's still quite clear to me that it's difficult to deliver outcomes in these conflict zones such that the terrorism threat that we face will ultimately be eliminated. Now, we have it within our power, in my view, to play very, very effective offense and very, very effective defense. We can do great work in building partner capacity, and as I said earlier, we do great work already in sharing intelligence more rapidly and more effectively than ever to enable our partners to act to help defend us. But truly altering the environment that gives rise to the terrorist threat we face, that's, in my mind, a much more formidable task. More resources are required, more time is required, and I would argue that patience is required. All one needs to do is look at the persistence of conflict in South Asia, the Levant, East Africa, and North Africa to understand the point I'm making. And so the unsolicited advice I would offer to anyone engaged in CT strategy development is simply this. Keep those underlying fundamentals in mind as you set forth to articulate new and bold strategic objectives, or to set timelines for the achievement of those objectives. This is not meant to be pessimistic. I truly do feel that we hold the upper hand against our terrorist adversaries, but it also remains true that terrorism emanating from conflict zones around the world will certainly remain a persistent feature of the national security landscape for at least as long as I serve in this position, and likely my successor as well. So I'll stop there, Liz. I'm happy to take a few questions, and I wish you well with the rest of your conference today.
Thank you. So now we'll do a few questions here. I'm going to ask a couple of quick ones at the beginning, but I will just say, if you're standing in the back and you'd like a seat, please feel free to come join us down here. There's some seats that you can use. So I have three quick questions that I want to ask. The first has to do with the nature of the threat, and two then about strategies. So first, looking back to the President Trump's Executive Order 13769 to, quote, entitled Protect the Nation from Foreign Terrorist Entry into the United States. Excuse me. Have you seen in the several months, looking at the data that you have accumulated since then, have you seen any uptick in online terrorist recruitment? Have you seen terrorists use that EO and policy around it as an effort as part of the narrative for recruitment?
Again, I'm going to be limited in terms of how much I can say about how we assess what our terrorist adversaries are up to. But I will say ISIS is a uniquely capable organization at grabbing onto grievance, grabbing onto features of the current political scene and turning those into mobilizing or galvanizing factors to try to recruit and bring people to the fight from their perspective. I don't know that I could point to any particular uptick or increase in ISIS recruitment that I would attach to just the last 3 months. I think it's too early to know how ISIS in particular is making use of what raw material they might feel like they have at their disposal. But it is something we're watching for. One of the things that makes this challenging, though, is, as I said at the podium, one of the things that we find difficult is that the pathway to radicalization, particularly for individuals here in the homeland, looks so very, very different in almost every case. There is almost always a unique and particularized story to tell about what brought that person. Was it this factor about U.S. involvement in the conflict overseas? Was it this factor tied more directly to their personal circumstance in the community they were living in? And so I'm a little bit reluctant to generalize on that point.
Noted. Okay, I'll ask my next two questions together so you can, for efficiency's sake, and you can address
Sure.
them. The first has to do with CT partnerships, and specifically Turkey as a partner. Turkey is an incredibly important partner, of course, in thinking about ISIS. However, it's, as we all know, undergoing a tremendous period of political instability, and because of the dismissal of 8,000 to 9,000 police officers, 8,000 to 9,000 military officers, there's a different constellation in their government ranks. What does that suggest to you about intel sharing with Turkey and about CT cooperation? How will that change going forward given what's going on in Turkey? Sorry, let me just ask you my second one too. Specifically about tech companies or internet hosting companies, they play a significant role, obviously, in enabling or facilitating, those are strong and loaded adjectives, or rather verbs, terrorist online activities, video hosting, content website as well. Can you talk a little bit about what an ideal relationship would be like between tech companies and the U.S. government in countering and addressing the terrorist threat?
I can try. The question with respect to Turkey
Yes,
first.
thank you.
There's no question but that we are reliant upon Turkey for effective counterterrorism cooperation, both in terms of mitigating the threat to U.S. interests and personnel inside Turkey, but also if our counter-ISIS campaign is to have the effect that we want, we're going to need effective Turkish cooperation across a whole number of fronts. In the interest of brevity, when I was describing, again at the podium, the decrease in the flow of foreign fighters into the conflict zone over the past year, in the interest of brevity, I left out something that is typically a part of my public remarks when speaking about that phenomenon, and that is a good chunk of that of the reason for that downturn in the flow of foreign fighters to the region is more effective work with our Turkish partners. That said, there is always more we can be doing to share better intelligence with each other more quickly in a more timely way, to increase the level of engagement and transparency that we have in working together on counterterrorism issues. I don't know that there's anybody who thinks we are at kind of the apex of where our counterterrorism cooperation with Turkey should be. There is always room for improvement, and we're constantly looking for ways to improve. My take on that has generally been that the way to do that is through substantive engagement on specific issues where we require cooperation, rather than engaging in kind of headline-grabbing assessments that describe whether someone is doing the job or not doing the job. It's much better if we have specific, concrete ways that we can offer our Turkish partners where they can help us and also seek where they need our help as well. Technology providers. There's no question but that the relationship that we in the government and in the intelligence community have with these technology providers continues to be a maturing relationship. And when I say maturing, I mean it has come a long way from where the dialogue started but a few years ago, but there's still quite a long way to go. I think one of the specific roles we play at NCTC is in helping to try to provide information to the technology companies so that they have a clear and complete understanding. In a sense, they become burdened with the knowledge of how their platforms are in fact not only accessible, but being exploited by foreign terrorist organizations or individuals engaged in terrorist activity. So within the constraints of sharing classified material or looking for the ways to make that information as accessible as possible to people outside the classified community, we're leaning forward pretty dramatically in this area to try to share that information. Again, to incentivize these partners, these companies to take steps that are within their capacity to take, and not to do so based solely on a request from the federal government, but to decide on their own that this is unacceptable behavior, that this is not how they wish their technology, not how they wish their product to be used. And you've seen some pretty striking examples of companies stepping forward. I don't want to single out any because that leads me in the direction of leaving out others, and I don't want to do that. But I would argue we've still got a long way to go. When you are talking about combining your efforts when two such disparate motivations exist, those of us in the government are charged with protecting our national security. They, the companies we are working with obviously have a commercial motive and a responsibility to their shareholders, and that may not put us on the same page at all times. But I would argue we're having a much more forthright and honest conversation with each other than we were perhaps a few years ago.
Thank you. I could ask you a lot more. I will refrain so that we can draw our audience into the conversation. If you have a question, can you raise your hand and I'll call on you. We'll have someone with the mic hand it to you. Please identify yourself and ask a question. No comments this morning. What I'll do is take a couple of questions and we'll do a round. If we have time, we might do one more. So first, here in the gray jacket with the sunglasses, and afterwards we'll go to the gentleman with the glasses, and there was the gentleman over here on the end of the row.
Hi, I'm Mimi Rupp, a former alum of NYU Law, and currently I'm at the Entertainment Software Association, and that's the trade group for video games. I work a lot in content protection. My question is whether infiltrating these groups has gotten easier in the post-9/11 landscape, and with respect to the disparate ISIL recruiting tactics, has that made it easier to infiltrate? And then kind of a third wrinkle, as you see so much terrorist networking online, if you will, has that made it easier to infiltrate these groups? Thank you.
And to the gentleman with the glasses. Yeah.
Eric Schmidt with the New York Times. Mr. Director, can you give us a status report on the so-called 30-day review to counter ISIS the administration's following through on? And then second, the president has created carve-outs in the presidential policy guidance for both Yemen and Somalia. I wonder if you can give us your assessment on how that's impacted, how helpful that's been, and if that's likely to be a model for other conflict areas, whether it be in Libya again, which you all did in the Obama administration, or perhaps in some other parts of West Africa, for instance. Thanks.
And finally?
I'm Michael Ryan from the Jamestown Foundation. You spoke, sir, about the CVE, and whenever I read anything in academic work about it, there's always a note that if the programs that are perceived by communities as connected to government, especially police or military, that they tend to shy away from them. So it's kind of a problem. How do you address those problems? And give me a little status on that.
Thank you.
Why don't I work in reverse order, just because my brain works that way. There's no question but that the efforts to engage with local communities on the effort to counter violent extremism is harder and more complicated when it comes with a law enforcement or intelligence face to it. It creates some level of suspicion within a community. My experience has been, though, that the only way that you overcome that is with full transparency. Go in, explain why you're there, explain why you're not there, provide information, provide hopefully useful information, and then, in a sense, step back and allow the kind of particular dynamics in that particular community go to work. It is probably one of the reasons why we don't have a one-size-fits-all approach to countering violent extremism across the country. When I talk about this with my experts who work on this at NCTC, they tell me that almost every community they've ever been in to have this conversation is a different ecosystem from the one they were in just before. And so the only thing I can say that gets around that level of suspicion that might come from having a law enforcement organization or an intelligence organization showing up in your neighborhood for that kind of conversation, the only way around that is to be as transparent as you can possibly be. Here's why we're here. We are here to help. We hope you will accept our help, but it ultimately is going to fall on the community to decide whether that help is welcome or not. With respect, Eric, to your questions, I'm not going to be able to be a whole lot of help to you this morning. The 30-day review task was assigned to the Defense Department and to Secretary Mattis under the terms of the executive order that President Trump signed, and that process is ongoing. The intelligence community of which I'm a part has a seat at the table in that conversation, and there are a round of interagency meetings underway to review the various ideas brought forward in the context of that 30-day review, but it doesn't fall to me to bring any headlines previewing that at this point. With respect to the arrangements that govern deployment of U.S. military, or employment of U.S. military force in Somalia and Yemen. Again, I'm not going to be able to be a whole lot of help on that either. That is something that is mostly the purview of the White House and the Defense Department to arrive at. And we in the intelligence community play a critical role in helping enable our DoD partners to carry out the counterterrorism actions that they take. Obviously, as this administration took office, it was natural and to be expected that they would want to review the rules of the road that would govern the employment of U.S. force in some of the parts of the world where we face serious terrorism problems. That work is underway, and adjustments have been made. I don't think I'm in a position yet to evaluate the payoff of those efforts. And actually, if I were in a position, I'd probably have a responsibility to offer that assessment to my colleagues in the administration rather than here on stage. And then the last.
Well, you can't blame us for trying.
You can't blame me for trying. The last question, the degree to which ISIS may be more easily penetrated because of the way in which they operate. Certainly the points you make in the question are intuitively attractive. ISIS is a far more democratic operation than anything we saw with Al-Qaeda. It is an organization that welcomes individuals into the fold in ways that Al-Qaeda was always very uncomfortable doing. The kind of screening and vetting that ISIS does as a terrorist organization falls far, far short of what Al-Qaeda used to do in terms of the barriers to entry for individuals who wanted to get into the movement. You would think logically that would provide intelligence organizations with opportunities, and you'd be right. I'm not going to be able to say too much more than that, and certainly the way that ISIS operates in the online environment also raises openings for intelligence organizations and other law enforcement organizations to take advantage of the behavior of these individuals online to either detect or somehow disrupt what they are doing. Again, not something I'm going to talk to in terms of specific detail about how we take advantage of that. If the premise of the question, though, is do we have a huge advantage in this area, I would push back a little bit, because I would think there are some other factors working against us in this domain, and I'm not here to talk about encryption or the challenges that encryption poses for our intelligence collection, but that's one of them. And so you could point to several things that add to our list of advantages, but I could point to some others that make it more difficult.
We'll be able to talk about some of those themes, encryption, anonymity, decentralization, in the next panel too. I'll take just a few more questions in a last quick final round. So we have here to start with, and then in the last row in the back after that, and over here as the final question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Nick, as you know. I'm Steve Shapiro with Business Executives for National Security. Hey, Matt. We're about structures and processes and making things efficient and effective in national security, and we've always been interested in the role of NCTC as a structural and process matter. And this is sort of a boring question in that regard, but an important one. The original statute provided that NCTC couldn't look at intel that was exclusively domestic, an order which, a piece of statute which was amended, I think, in 13 or 14, and you now can look at intel that is exclusively domestic. So the question is two parts. Has NCTC truly become the central clearinghouse for all intelligence, the connecting agency for all domestic and foreign intelligence? And I am curious with respect to Bureau, DHS, CPB, all the sub-agencies, Fusion Center, et cetera, and that's one half of the question. The other half is, I was also intrigued by NCTC's community outreach, which began under Matt and apparently has expanded under you. I heard you mention that you're doing these community events in connection with DHS and FBI. So is this an overlap? Is this part of your mission? Should someone, is there a reason for 3 agencies to be out there doing these dog and ponies, or should it be some specific DHS entity, which of course has this as part of their mandate? And I'm not necessarily sure that dog and ponies are part of your mandate, so I'm curious about you guys in the domestic field is what I'm talking about.
Thanks. In the back row. Yasmin. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Jung-Soo Kim. I'm a student from the University of Southern California. And my question is, well, could you just comment on the threat of al-Qaeda in Syria, or Tahrir al-Sham, and moving forward, how do we deal with them given all the factors that make doing anything in Syria really difficult? Thank you.
Thanks. And our final question came from over here on the third row up, I believe.
Morning, my name is Medgar Reed. I am on the FBI Citizens Academy Board for Diversity. And my question really is more in line with morale of the intelligence community. And how is that, in your assessment, coming along? I think that, you know, many people have seen on the national stage people saying, I love WikiLeaks. And how does that make your job tougher or easier as far as morale is concerned?
All right, I'll do the reverse order thing again.
Yeah, go for it.
Last time.
Thank you.
I would broaden the question out a little bit more broadly. I think any time you have a heightened political environment, which we certainly had over the last year, an election year, and not just any election year, but an election year in which the issues were particularly sharp, and the intelligence community, like it or not, was drawn into the conversation in ways that is generally and genuinely uncomfortable for intelligence professionals. So stipulate all that this was not a usual scenario. As a matter of morale in terms of the workforce I deal with, I felt like it was my job to do as much as possible to reassure my colleagues, my peers, my team at NCTC that the work they were doing and do every day has unique importance, has unchanging importance, and that nothing that's going on in the political environment right now, positively, negatively, or otherwise, should shape how they approach their jobs and the degree of care and commitment they bring to work every day. Now, that's easy to say, but it's also difficult, I think, to accomplish. And there's no doubt but that when you read about your work in the newspapers, and it's in a way that's bringing it into the political fray, that does cause a sense of concern among the workforce. I would argue especially with younger colleagues. Those of us who've been around for a while have lived through presidential transitions, and there is not much that happens in those transitions that in some way or some form or fashion you haven't dealt with before. Some of my colleagues who may only have 5 or 6 or 7 years in the intelligence community, this was the first political transition they were ever a part of, and so it was natural that this would be more disconcerting to them than you might expect. I think we are at a point now where I'm pretty comfortable that my team at NCTC understands the mission they have, the critical role they play. It's my job to keep reassuring them that what they're doing is useful, it's important, it's essential, it serves the national interest, and that exists entirely apart from politics, and I hope it stays that way. With respect to the question in the back, al-Qaeda in Syria is undoubtedly a challenge, and some of what I described at the podium about the kind of continued lethality of al-Qaeda as a global terrorist organization was tied to al-Qaeda's presence in Syria, and the fact that over time there's been a steady accumulation of key al-Qaeda figures who have made their way to Syria to not only participate in the conflict there, but also to potentially serve as a center of gravity for al-Qaeda as a global organization. That is not a good thing. There's no question about that, because our ability to put pressure on them in that environment is somewhat limited. I don't have a good answer for you in terms of how we would, with the stroke of a pen, arrive at a solution in Syria that would give us the outcome that we want from a counterterrorism perspective. That's some of the reason why I said what I said at the tail end of my remarks about having clear eyes and a sense of humility about defining counterterrorism objectives when we are in fact find that our counterterrorism objectives are enmeshed with really complicated and difficult regional security problems like the war in Syria right now. My hope is that as we proceed down the path towards some solution in Syria, we can continue to just get better at the business of isolating, finding, and targeting those individuals in Syria who would do us harm, especially those, principally those tied to al-Qaeda, And if we can keep up that good work while we are awaiting a longer-term, more durable solution, that will be a good counterterrorism outcome. Last question, back to you, Steve. On the question of NCTC's role in the community engagement work I described earlier, everything I described we are doing, and much of what I described, again, in my remarks about the information we're sharing with state and local communities and law enforcement organizations, much of that is done in literally a three-headed way with the FBI and with DHS. And I come at this from the perspective of not trying to elbow out my FBI and DHS brothers and sisters, but rather with the idea of NCTC is smaller, it can be more agile and adept sometimes, and we have some unique value added in these areas with some of the expertise we've developed. I'm not interested in going anywhere to show up one of my interagency partners or to elbow them out of the way. What I'm there to do, what my team is there to do is, as I said, to bring some value added and particularly on the questions of homegrown extremism, bring some of the expertise we have to bear in terms of making it a more informative and useful conversation. There's nothing in that activity that I have seen that causes FBI or DHS any concern, at least not in my recent experience. We are, as I said, full partners in this work together, and so I don't see anything incongruous or at odds with our authorities. On the question of domestic intelligence, I mean, as you know, the founding legislation that created NCTC, the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act, spoke to NCTC having responsibility for everything save for domestic terrorism. And I think that's still a line we pretty much adhere to. My team at NCTC is not tracking right-wing or left-wing extremist movements here in the United States. We are not collecting information and providing analysis on groups that would not fall within the traditional spectrum of terrorism as we understand it. We do, as a matter of analytics, look to see how extremism develops when motivated by these other factors, when not motivated by some of the factors that motivate Sunni terrorists. So that, for example, we can compare how does radicalization and the mobilization to violence, how does that look in this particular set of circumstances as opposed to an extremist who might be motivated by another set of factors. There's a lot of commonality there. Even if we are not tracking this and collecting data on individuals in the same way we would with respect to terrorism, we can learn a lot from what the FBI has learned over time about domestic terrorism and the way that those movements operate and the way that individuals move down the path towards violence. So I think we're harvesting the good that can come from looking at that set of issues while still standing well clear of stepping into FBI's lane, because it's FBI's lane to deal with the domestic terrorism problem, as you describe it. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very much for spending time with us this morning, even a little longer than you had originally planned and we advertised. Everyone, please keep your seats. We'll move right into the next panel, but before that, join me in thanking our speaker with a round of applause.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us, and a big thanks to Director Rasmussen for a really enlightening talk. There was a lot in there, and I hope we'll pick up some of the conversations here. You've got the bios of the really extraordinary experts that we have with us this morning. Very briefly, to my left, Aaron Brantly of the Army Cyber Institute, Matt Olson, who was Director Rasmussen's predecessor as director of the NCTC and is now the president of IronNet Cybersecurity, Audrey Cronin of American University, and Aaron Zelin of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. So I'll just get things started and pick sort of up where Director Rasmussen left off, and maybe Matt, I'll turn to you first. There was a lot that the director talked about in terms of the threat landscape and our response to it. I was hoping you might pick up some of those threads, be a little bit more specific in what you see as some of the areas of continuity and some of the areas of change, both with respect to the threat and with respect to the U.S. response in the counterterrorism world from Presidents Obama to Trump.
Okay, sure. It's a great question, Zach. Thank you, first of all, for hosting this along with CNAS. It's great to be here, and it's an honor to follow Nick, although I note that he did not stay around to hear me speak. I was here for his entire talk, and he decided, I guess he has some more important things to do. Totally understandable. And it's kind of fun to be here too as the former director of NCTC, where I can speak. Obviously Nick is in the middle of it, right? So he has to be a little more constrained in how he can talk about some of these issues. And while I'm not as close to the issues, I don't have the skiff in my house anymore, which I miss. I definitely miss that, and the daily briefing every morning. The perspective you gain, and that you guys have as people who follow this closely from the outside. The perspective you gain is valuable from a strategic perspective, and it allows you to think a little bit more long term and with a little more distance about these issues. So I think this question of continuity and change is a great question as we enter into sort of the heart of the new administration, and a lot of the questions that Nick got sort of touched on that. I think my perspective, this is sort of bottom line up front on this question, is in general we expect there to be consistency from one year, one administration to the next. That's generally a good thing too. It reflects that the way we develop CT policy is driven by the threat, that there are lots of professionals around the government who are dedicated to going after the threat, that there's constraints imposed by the institutions and laws that sort of guide those policies, and that's a good thing, and that we've seen that over the years. And I think that's at risk. I think that whether we see that consistency in this administration is an open question, and I think there's some reason to be concerned about that. So let me just unpack that a little bit, just take a couple minutes to do that. I was in the administration during the Bush administration. I was a career person at Justice when President Obama was elected, and I think that there was a fair point that change you can believe in. President Obama became, at least on the counterterrorism side, really consistency you can count on from President Bush to President Obama. I mean, for sure there were some changes around issues on Gitmo, interrogation, sort of the emphasis on criminal prosecutions, and some other issues. But for the most part, you saw a fair amount of consistency. The way in which we did lethal targeting, the surveillance issues, really until Snowden, there was a lot of consistency there. And I think just overall the mix between the use of military power and the use of diplomacy and law enforcement and intelligence as it brought to bear on the policy questions, a lot of consistency in the end between President Obama and President Bush before him. And again, I think this reflects some important aspects of the overall counterterrorism landscape. One is that it's threat-driven. The policy is driven by the threat, what we heard Nick talk about. And while that threat certainly evolves and is dynamic, it's that threat that really drives the policy, and that's critical. It also reflects the constraints imposed by institutions like the military or law enforcement or our diplomatic corps and the State Department, how those institutions operate. There's consistency from administration to administration, which I think reflect the professionalism of that workforce, and I think that's a really positive thing. The consistency is also a reflection of the constraints imposed by laws. I mean, obviously, as a lawyer, a critical aspect of our counterterrorism policy, and policies as well that sort of give life to those laws. And I think, again, that is a positive thing because it gives people in the intelligence community or in the military something that they can hold on to, right, as we go from year to year and administration to administration. Expectations and predictable ways in which we're going to carry out that policy. And the reason, and I'll sort of end with this, the reason I think that this is potentially in jeopardy is the last piece of this, and that is as we look at sort of how the rhetoric goes around from President Trump versus President Obama. And I don't mean rhetoric in the sense of just campaign slogans, although that is a part of the rhetoric, but really the things that the president says. And I think there's reason to believe that, where you had President Obama very committed to founding our counterterrorism policy on values. One of his key points was, we are strongest when we act consistent with our values. And the statements that have come from President Trump on those points, on the values point, I think is reason to think that we may not see that same degree of consistency, whether it's about Muslim ban or killing terrorist families, the statements around the intelligence community. So I think it remains to be seen. Are we in for substantial change, which I think will be disruptive to the extent that we don't found those policies on the laws and values that we've seen in the past, or are we are we going to see consistency? So I think the fundamental answer to the question is I think it's an open question. And I think to the extent that we see a significant disruption, that it would undermine our counterterrorism policies.
Got it. Thanks, Matt. That's extraordinarily helpful. And I think later in the conversation, I want to return to the role of values and why is it that our values are so central to our counterterrorism strategy. But before we do that, I'll turn to you, Audrey. One of the things I think in which there's at least some amount of change, I think I agree with Matt about the degree of continuity, is in the military approach to counterterrorism. So there has been an undeniable increase in the number of strikes, changes to things like designations of the zone of active hostilities, which may be kind of wonkish, but is really, really important, I think, from a public messaging perspective, also from a legal perspective in terms of the constraints and the processes that apply to use of force. So that, I think, is what we know, for certain in terms of a little bit of a change in the last 100 whatever days, not that that matters. So talk a little bit, if you would, about the role of military force in the counterterrorism threat environment that Nick Rasmussen described. I think the threat he described is one that is not intuitively very, very responsive to military force in the same way a kind of centralized Al-Qaeda of 2001, for example, might have been.
Sure. Well, let me start out by saying that I think that military force is essential, that we had no choice but to confront ISIS, which had become a pseudo-state, and to push it back towards being something closer to an insurgency, and eventually, I think, closer to a more classic type of terrorist organization. There's no alternative to that. That doesn't mean that we won't continue to deal with strikes in places like Paris and Brussels and San Bernardino and the very unfortunate sort of alternative of pushing ISIS to change the subject, pushing them to carry out attacks that distract from the fact that they're losing on the battlefield and try to give the audience a different story. In the short term, I think the threat of terrorist attacks, and certainly I honor what Director Rasmussen had to say, the short-term threat of terrorist attacks is going to increase. But with the realization that military force is necessary, there are a number of things that really worry me. And the first is that we still haven't articulated a coherent strategy, particularly for the region. It's not enough just to talk about using military force. We must also realize that there is a kind of a tension between our desire to rid the region of this pseudo-caliphate and our desire for stability within the Middle East. Those two continue to be in tension, and nobody really wants to make a choice between them. And we cannot have a strategy or any kind of coherent plan without choosing. So that's my first concern. We'll see what comes out of the administration. I don't know. Secondly, military force is never enough. We've been saying this for 15 years. We've been trying to build up all of the other policy tools, many of them under Director Rasmussen and you, Director Olson, have been built up. But unfortunately, moving forward, it looks as if the kinds of budgets that have supported the other tools are being reduced, and that which supports the military is being increased. This doesn't mean that military force is less important, only that it will be less effective, because it never works singly. It always has to work in concert with other types of policy tools, particularly when it comes to counterterrorism. There's no alternative. The third thing I would say is that we've made a huge mistake in not dealing with the fate of Syrian and Iraqi refugees. I think this was an enormous strategic error. It wasn't just a matter of sort of, liberal or sort of soft sentiment. This is a proof of what the West thinks is its message, and it works in direct contraposition to what we say we want to do. And it is an enormous humanitarian crisis, and it's undermining our own European allies. What could be more important than maintaining close alliances? And now we see, not for reasons that are unrelated, the European Union under great threat. So that was a strategic error on the part of the United States, and I think we still need to address that problem. The fourth thing I'm concerned about is the role of foreign fighters. And Director Rasmussen referred to this. I realize that it's something that we're very aware of, and the NCTC is tracking very closely. But if you look in kind of the broad perspective, which, you know, sort of professors like me who don't have to deal with the day-to-day are able to do, we can be a little irresponsible, okay? That's my privilege. I respect those who do the day-to-day. I greatly honor your service. But being a little irresponsible, let's look back at the track of different conflicts that have led us to where we are today. You know, we start with Afghanistan, and we go to the Balkans, and we go to Chechnya. We move onward to Afghanistan again, and we move to the Caucasus again, and Iraq and Syria now. I mean, I may have left out a few. But at each point along the way, we've had a mobilization of foreign fighters, and at each point along the way, the mobilization has on the whole gotten larger, and now it's happening faster and more globally than ever before because of all the aspects of social media and globalization and other things that are the realities of our world. So something is not going well here. If what we're dealing with is a marauding army, maybe it's not one coherent force, but it's a group of stateless people and those from ISIS who have burned their own passports and either will return and be a problem or won't return and be a part of this sort of foreign fighters phenomenon. Something isn't going right, and we have to face the fact that there has to be some kind of track to offer a more normalized lifestyle to people that would be willing to transition into it. I mean, again, this is not sentimentality. This is a matter of looking over the broad sweep of history and what we've accomplished and not accomplished. And then the last thing I would say is that I think that our lack of sort of strategic thinking and long-term thinking has led us into some very difficult and short-sighted approaches toward other major powers. Russia and Iran in particular, they seem to have a far better concept of what they want long-term, and they're very happy for the United States to use overwhelming military force and to sweep in and take advantage in some respects of the aftermath. And I would also say that we need to look long-term at other major powers outside the immediate region. So that's my concern about overusing military force compared to the other things. It's not just a matter of the balance among the different policy tools, but it's also a matter of the time frame. We seem to be so short-term that we're not looking at the broader sweep of what we're accomplishing.
That was fantastic, Audrey. Thank you so much. And Aaron, Aaron Z., turn to you. I want to pick up on threads that Audrey addressed, and also one of the more interesting and perhaps provocative things that Nick Rasmussen said, which is that there isn't necessarily a direct link between the status of the battlefield in Iraq and Syria and the ability of ISIS to project power outside Iraq and Syria. So if you wouldn't mind, I'd like you to unpack that a little bit. Maybe start with just kind of a status update. Where are things in the battles for the two main capitals for ISIS, Mosul and Raqqa in Iraq and Syria, and then how you understand that relationship between the state of the battlefield in the Levant and the ability to conduct attacks outside in Europe and the United States.
Yeah, I fully agree with Director Rasmussen's comments on that in terms of there not necessarily being a true correlation or connection between what's going on in the battlefield in Iraq and Syria and what's going on in Western Europe in particular. I think a lot of this has to do with new technologies in many respects, which Director Rasmussen talked about briefly at the end, and which Aaron will talk about after me. And the fact that one of the things you see is that you've already had more than 1,000 people returning back into their home countries at this point. I mean, if you recall, the first attack that happened was 3 years ago this month in May in Brussels against a Jewish museum. So this isn't anything new that's going on right now. And there's a lot of other factors as well that's different between now and, say, the foreign fighter and external operation campaign with al-Qaeda. We should recall that al-Qaeda's initial external operation campaign was from 1998 until 2005 with the July 7th bombings in London. That's 7 years, and there's a lot less factors involved then. Many of the individuals were not actually citizens from those countries where they're attacking in Western nations, whereas most of the people now that actually went from Western Europe are citizens of those countries. And the reality is that because of this, law enforcement is overwhelmed. There are so many people that they have to follow, and you can only follow somebody for 24 hours. You have to pick and choose essentially between who is the biggest threat, and that's one of the reasons why you'll hear in the news so many times that law enforcement in France or Germany knew about this guy, but he slipped through the cracks. But part of that is because they have to decide which resources go to which person, and unfortunately some people seem like they might not be an immediate threat. And I would expect, even though as the Islamic State is about to lose Mosul completely, some people are saying that it could be the month of May that this happens, as the campaign is heating up towards Raqqa. It's not necessarily going to affect this external operations capacity because they do have the ability to remotely control some of these plots in a way that Al-Qaeda didn't necessarily have because of these communications. As I noted below, there's also another factor, especially that we've seen come out in the last year or two, is that there's a growing feedback loop in some respects between some of the ideas between jihadists in Western countries, but also far right-wing extremists in Western countries as well. And therefore, even if something might not even be going on in Iraq and Syria, this could further inflame things locally, and as a result, that's an issue. I just wanted to say two more things that I think are relevant, but not quite as immediate as related to the campaign specifically in Iraq and Syria, or the immediate threat to Western Europe in particular, is that one of the things we saw in past foreign fighter flows that I think will be relevant here is the issue of jihadi diasporas. And this goes back to one of Director Rasmussen's comments that there aren't really that many people leaving per se right now from Iraq and Syria. They're staying in Iraq and Syria. Part of this is because of Turkey's efforts to close off the border, but also many of these individuals can't necessarily go back to their home countries either. And we saw this, I think a good case of this to examine is the case of Tunisia, where we saw prior to 2011 that most of the Tunisian jihadists that were involved were primarily involved in Europe or in Afghanistan and Iraq. But then once society opened up, they flooded back into their country. And this partially helps explain why there are so many Tunisian jihadists these days, even though most people weren't paying attention. And I would say that you see a similar dynamic possibly going on now with some individuals from places like Chechnya or Dagestan, or places like Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan. And that while they might not be an immediate threat to those countries, if some type of Arab uprising type of scenario happens in one of those countries in 5, 10, 15, 20, who knows how many years, but they could then reinsert themselves back in these countries, and it could be an immediate threat to those countries going forward. And then the last thing I'd note that most people aren't paying attention to is not the foreign fighter flows related to Iraq and Syria, but the ones going to Libya and CERT with the Islamic State. Of course, the Islamic State no longer controls territory in Libya, but for the first time ever, we did see people from West and East Africa becoming foreign fighters. Prior to this, most people from these nations were involved in local insurgencies. So this helps create new networks, but also helps create alumni of this conflict that can then go back to their home nations and recruit. And the best recruiters of new jihadists are people that had previously been foreign fighters. And this is why countries such as Sudan maybe, or Senegal, or Kenya could be issues where you saw people in larger numbers getting involved in these issues, but their governments might not be paying attention in the same way. And I'd argue it's not an acute threat in the same way you see with Western Europe now, but it is akin to sort of the Western Europeans that went to Afghanistan in the late 80s or Bosnia in the early to mid 1990s. So there's seeds of it, but it's definitely an issue going forward. And then finally, one country that has sort of not been touched by this in Western Europe has been Italy, but there are larger concerns about the connections between what's going on in Libya and the migrant flows into Italy and whether they can handle it, especially since some of the facilitation and logistics networks historically were based in Italy, even if there weren't really attacks there. So it's another layer I would add to this problem set, unfortunately.
We'll host the next version of this in Rome, and we'll try and wrap our heads around the problem there. Aaron B., I'd like to turn to you last and pick up on a crumb that Nick Rasmussen left about encryption and ask you to talk a little bit about how terrorist groups are using it, why it's a problem. It was a big public debate and discussion in the U.S. about a year ago surrounding the San Bernardino attacks, but kind of where things seem to have faded from the headlines. So where do things stand here? How are terrorist groups using encryption? And if you wanted to kind of broaden the aperture a little bit, a lot of the conversation this morning revolved around the ease of communications and the way in which technology facilitates a more fragmented and dispersed threat. So talk a little bit about that as well.
So encryption within terrorist communities is not novel. It's something that's been going on for quite a while. Al-Qaeda in particular has been pushing encrypted technologies for pretty much the better part of their existence, or some form or manner of communications. The object goal is to avoid intelligence and law enforcement agencies, and to be quite honest, they've been relatively successful at doing that, using encryption. And so the natural response of open, free societies is to say, hey, people are trying to kill us and they're communicating using encrypted applications. We should get rid of encryption applications. And they do this through a lot of different ways, first of all. So they train one another in forums or in chat rooms. They do it in local communities and other organizational groups. The simple fact that encrypted technologies have become far more pervasive in recent years and far easier to use. In fact, my guess is that almost everybody in this room is using encrypted messaging in some form or another, whether you're using iMessage or something else. And so these types of communications platforms are becoming ubiquitous, and they are definitely posing a challenge to intelligence and law enforcement communities, particularly when they want to see inside the communications and not just look at metadata or other types of things on the outside. That being said, it's a very important thing to recognize that encryption for communications is only one small part of the overall schema of encryption. And then there's also, talking with lawyers, there's also a very important thing to consider here with encryption is that just because we break into their applications or we reduce the security on applications in the United States does not mean that that's going to reduce the security of applications produced anywhere else in the world. In fact, right now there's 36 GPL open source licensed encryption applications that are produced in multiple countries around the world. So I backdoor into an encryption application, WhatsApp or something produced in the United States, subject to US jurisdiction, then what's to keep them from switching to another one? Now, I think that Director Rasmussen and others would say, well, that at least opens up one venue for us to explore their communications, one avenue in which we can minimize this particular communicative platform. But on the flip side, it also makes it more challenging because it means that no longer do we have the relationship with the community of technologists and technology developers that are doing this. And I think that Director Rasmussen hinted that it's that relationship within the community, within Facebook, WhatsApp, within Facebook, Twitter, and others, that really facilitates intelligence and law enforcement processes. And so if we mandate them to break their own encryption and other things along those lines, are we actually shifting the problem elsewhere? Are we going to see the facilitation of novel encrypted technologies elsewhere? In fact, in the last 6 years or so, and maybe Aaron Z can talk a little bit about this as well, we've identified at least 6 different versions with Al-Qaeda's use of Asar al-Mujahideen, which is an encrypted messaging application that they developed endogenously within their own organization. And we see them using a lot of different other things. It's also important to recognize that if I use encryption to communicate and do recruitment, it's a very crappy way of recruiting people. Because if I hide my communications, it's very hard for me to convince you to join my organization. So if I go into the dark web and I say, join ISIS, join Al-Qaeda, and you never see it, it's like going into it's like if a tree falls in the woods and no one's around to hear it, doesn't make a sound. So they can only use encryption when they're in the planning, operational, and organizational phases of the organization. All the other stuff, the recruitment and everything else, has to happen somewhere else, usually in the clear and in the open communication realm of some sort, or through directed networks. And so these are very important issues to consider as we talk about the development of terrorist networks, their continued recruitment, and military and intelligence efforts to break these networks down. Generally, the most robust way, and I would agree with Director Rasmussen, is the most resilient way to combat these types of things is not through the breaking of encryption, but through the development of inclusive and robust communities and societies that eliminate the causal mechanisms, not all, but some of the causal mechanisms that lead to these things as well. And I think that it's as Audrey says, I think that it is a whole approach. You can't focus on one without the other. If you do, then you're kind of shunting things into different directions. And I think that's where I'll leave it. There's no single solution. Encryption is still valid.
Good. Matt, I would like to return to you on the values point. You know, Audrey made the point that the refugee issue is not it's not only a humanitarian issue. Obviously, it's a very significant humanitarian concern, but also a strategic one. My perception, you know, one of the key differences, again, between the Trump and the Obama administration is the emphasis on American values and the role those American values play in our conception of our role in the world. So talk a little bit about why that matters from a counterterrorism perspective and how it relates to our own strategic approach to counterterrorism issues.
Sure, and I think, Audrey, I think your point was really spot on, that, and on the issue of refugees coming from Syria, and it really does, you know, I think, highlight this question, the broader question of the role of values as a strategic issue, not a sentimental one, right? Not a you know, lightweight way of thinking about the problem. You know, in some ways, you know, why are these our values, right? These are issues like our openness and tolerance and concern about humanitarian issues on the scale of what we've seen in Syria. These are the values that have led us to be leaders of the free world. And for what we saw in the, you know, at the beginning of the administration and during the campaign on this issue, yeah, it struck me as, I think rightly put, Audrey, a strategic mistake for a couple reasons. One, you know, and it's useful just to focus on this to kind of answer your broader question, Zach. You know, we had the opportunity to welcome Syrian refugees here, and what that spoke to the world as well as to ISIS is that we were, you know, we were going to live up to our values, and we were going to be really the counterexample to what is happening in Syria. These are people who are leaving Syria because they have been victimized by ISIS, right? So by welcoming them here to the United States, we are, you know, positioning ourselves effectively as a counterexample to ISIS. That's one point. The second point is by engaging in, you know, the sort of rhetoric around anti-Muslim rhetoric, or the rhetoric around this issue of welcoming refugees, we were really feeding a very strong propaganda point to ISIS, who would like to portray us as enemies of the Muslim world, and that we are engaged, in their view, from a propaganda perspective, in a conflict that, you know, West versus the Muslim world, or a religious war. And, you know, that is a strong recruitment point for ISIS. I think Nick really, he answered that question about whether we've seen examples so far of ISIS picking up on that. I mean, I think those of you who've studied this, there are examples of ISIS using this in their propaganda. How effective it's been, whether, you know, it's hard to measure the number of people it's recruited or anything like that at this point. But I don't think there's any question, at least in my mind, that that's a point that ISIS has and will use effectively in its propaganda in recruiting people. And it's just, again, it's a specific example of where, you know, as we look forward, will this rhetoric become our policy? And you know, and if it does, I think it'll demonstrate a break from the past, and it will undermine our overall efforts.
Got it. Thank you. I want to talk now about allies. So Liz and Nick Rasmussen talked about Turkey. Aaron, I'll turn to you in a minute to talk about the Gulf, Saudi, the UAE, and what those relationships look like at present. Audrey, I want to turn to you, though, and talk about the EU. What's going on? There seems to be a steady drip of small-scale attacks. London a couple of weeks ago, Champs-Élysées shootings just a week or two ago. I think there's a consensus among us, certainly, and sounds like Nick Rasmussen, things will likely get worse before they get better. Why?
Well, I think that again, I'm going to take the sort of professorial broad perspective on this, but the history of terrorism shows you that one of the most effective strategies of a group is to try to polarize the society that it's engaged against. And, you know, you've seen this regularly over the centuries in the use of terrorism to try, especially when it comes to democratic democracies, to try to drive a wedge between members of that society so as to make it impossible for there to be any sort of moderate policy, and you have people turning against each other instead. I mean, you've seen that everywhere, from Uruguay to, there's many examples historically. And I think that this is the most dangerous potential thing for the United States and for the European allies. I see it as happening a little bit more in an advanced stage in Europe for complicated reasons, and in individual nation states for different reasons. But polarization is not just a matter of the rise of populism as a result of the broad factors that have fed into that, but also because it's something that serves the interests of our adversaries when it comes to ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And what really, really worries me is that the more that we fail to deal with issues like the ones that Director Olson just mentioned, related to our values and our identity and our unity and our ability to pull together and basically, you know, to put it in the simplest terms, to be the good guys together, the more we give them a wonderful tool to carry out the kinds of attacks that are facilitated by very tiny numbers of people in each of our countries, but nonetheless taking advantage of others who follow them.
Got it. Thank you. And Aaron, you know, the issues with our allies in the Gulf, very, very different, but perhaps equally complicated. Our relationship with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, obviously very close counterterrorism partners, but with a significant divergence, in particular now around Yemen policy and a difference in threat perception, perhaps, between the U.S. and our allies in the Gulf. So maybe just give us a sense of where things stand between us and them, and where they're likely to go, maybe focused on Syria and Yemen.
Yeah, I think that what the Trump administration is attempting to do is try and re-engaging a lot of the allies in the Gulf, especially Saudi and the Emirates. Part of this goes back to the fact that the Obama administration was most interested in national security threats related to Iran's nuclear program, as well as the threat of Al-Qaeda and then eventually the resurgence of the Islamic State, whereas a lot of the Gulf states were more concerned about Iran's activities in the region, not necessarily specifically the nuclear program. So there was a divergence with this, and as a consequence of the Obama administration doing this nuclear deal, kind of left out Iran's activities, whether it was with their proxy support with Hezbollah, whether it was with the building of larger proxy networks in Iraq and Syria, whether it was starting to provide more weapons to militants in Bahrain and in Yemen. And as a consequence, this was a more immediate threat for many of these Gulf states, especially in Bahrain and Yemen in particular. But as a consequence, there's a possibility that by completely, necessarily buying into what is the interest first of the Gulf states, that will undermine the U.S.'s interests in the region, because we could then potentially get bogged down in a Yemen war where the Houthis are not necessarily a strategic threat to the United States. Of course, they're a threat within the region and a threat in relation to Iran's broader activities, but we don't necessarily want to get engaged in a large-scale war in Yemen. And as we've seen with the history of wars in Yemen, they usually don't end up too well in the same way that we've seen with Afghanistan. So I do think it's good that we are re-engaging in a better way with a lot of these Gulf allies, but there are definitely some possible pitfalls that could lead us into further problems in the future, too, because of it.
Fascinating. Aaron, I want to wrap up with you, and then we'll turn things over to the audience. One of the other, I think, really interesting comments that Nick Rasmussen made is that the path to radicalization domestically is highly idiosyncratic. So it's very difficult to extract a set of rules or principles or guidance that would give law enforcement and intelligence professionals a way to identify in advance the kinds of folks that are likely to go from radical to radical and violent. And I'm curious if that's true, then how important do you think the online propaganda discussion is? There was a sense maybe a year or 18 months ago that this was it. Unless we wrapped our heads around this problem, we were never going to address the threat from domestic terrorism. Nick Rasmussen's comments maybe suggest that that isn't quite true. So maybe talk a little bit about that dynamic.
First, I forgot to say in the beginning that I'm not representing the Department of the Army or the Department of Defense.
Will that make your what's to follow more interesting?
Yeah, so I think there's another, so that's very true. We have to wrap our brains around the technology aspects of it. And I think Audrey has a book coming out on a lot of this stuff as well. But the technology is, I mean, we're really just at the infancy stage of the digital era. We think we're heavily into it, but we're not. We're just kind of starting out. And the reality is this, a lot of the work that I've done has shown enormous promise on being able to track and identify individuals using big data and other types of things very robust. I mean, without going into super details of operations, we've become very, very good at identifying particular individuals. So if there's a terrorist incident somewhere in the world, we can literally go through all social media posts going back 8 or 9 years, possibly, and examine who is expressing positive sentiment towards this particular thing. Now, that doesn't mean that, that's a huge pool, but that begins to narrow down a broader universe of people so that instead of focusing on 1,000 targets or something like that, you're focusing on the targets in your particular geographic area or something like that. And not necessarily working on criminal prosecution, but doing the type of community engagement and saying, you know, what about this particular individual or something, this idiosyncratic aspect of it, are we missing? How can we bring them back into a community, into a team of people within the broader society? It's not perfect. It's going to probably get better whether we like it or not from a privacy perspective standpoint. And there are a lot of really good aspects of this. But we definitely need to wrap our brains around this, and we need to continue to focus on thinking of creative solutions that leverage both the human, the small data, and the big data in tandem to generate more efficient solutions. Because right now, using something like facial recognition at, say, at Chicago O'Hare or JFK would bring up roughly 500,000 false positives in a year. And that's just unsustainable. And you got to bring it down to, you know, a much more manageable base. And that's where we're moving, but we're still in the early stages of that.
Got it. Thanks. I believe we've got microphones kind of scattered throughout. Maybe we can start here with the gentleman in the 4th row and then work our way around.
Yes, good morning. The question will be regarding the eternal issue that the Muslim world is facing. I'm saying Muslim from a geographical perspective more than religious, because the question is as follows. These Muslim countries, ever since the colonization, have dealt with two evils that the United States have yet to control, because they are not the administrations of each country. They have to deal either with the extremist way of doing things or the dictatorial way of doing things that is presented by Saddam Hussein, by Assad's family, or by the situation of Erdogan in Turkey. My question is it really strategically sane for the United States to let Erdogan policy goes further, following the recent events, political events in Turkey, which can create a civil disorder inside of Turkey, because there will be extremist group against the policy of Erdogan, and therefore create probably a loss of a strategic ally of the United States in the area. So what strategically could be done by from a Trump-Tillerson perspective? Thank you.
Great. Stable autocrats versus messy democracy. Anyone want to take a stab at that one? Perhaps with a little bit of turkey sprinkled on.
Well, I don't think that. Okay.
Everybody's jumping out of their
Fools
seat.
rush in. I'll only say that I don't think that's those are the alternatives that the questioner was offering. He was talking about extremism versus dictatorial leadership. And actually, I think messy democracy is the answer to your question.
The general sphere of the question in regard of something that the United States cannot handle at every national level, and the specific, I think, answer would be in regards of the Turkish example, within the circumstance that has happened in Turkey with Erdogan recently. what's at stake?
I'm not willing to address the specific circumstances that have happened in Turkey directly. Perhaps some of my colleagues would be. But I would say that messy democracy by definition is not something that the United States is directing.
Again, I would just go back to this idea of values. And I think values, so realpolitik, international relations is always going to be nasty and messy. And we have to deal with who we get, okay? I mean, we don't get to choose other states' governance structures or other things like that. But so long as we establish our clear values, as Matt has alluded to, and we stand by those values, then we potentially can serve as a model to facilitate messy democracy and other types of things that we, I think, have demonstrated fairly robustly within IR literature and others that it reduces conflict overall. Maybe not in the initial stages of messy democracy, but over the long term.
Great. Ma'am, and if you wouldn't please introduce yourself before you ask a question. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Fariba Pajou. I am an Iranian journalist, and I'm a student in Northwestern University Medical School. So I have two questions, and it's about Iran. And I want to know that what you think about Iran. Is Iran, in this topic you are talking about, is part of solution or is a part of problem? Or can be a part of solution or not? And another thing, when you are talking about, it's very interesting for me. When I was in many conferences, and I saw when in general, talking about terrorism, I cannot see somebody talk about the role of the countries like Saudi, like Pakistan. This administration, they have to have responsibility about their citizens, because all they happen in Paris, in many countries, European countries. If you check the citizenship of the guys, had expulsion, they are coming from these countries. And I want to know why somebody, you in general, not you gentlemen, ladies, don't attention to this. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, I didn't answer the last question, so now I have to answer this one. It's a good question, right? And I think one of the things that struck me about, and Nick had only so much time to talk about the issues that we face from a terrorism perspective, but he really focused on Sunni terrorism. He didn't really talk about Iran and its role in supporting terrorism and supporting conflict in the region. So the sort of short answer to your initial part of your questions, Iran is part of the problem now in terms of its support for Hezbollah and in other parts of the Middle East, which you talked about, and in fomenting conflict. But it, like other countries, has to be part of the solution longer term. And really, in Nick's kind of overview, he really didn't have time to talk about the other forms of conflict and terrorism. And one of the problems, of course, of what's driving conflict and instability in the region is the sectarian conflict that we see. So from the United States' interest, and this is the last thing I'll say, is just we need to, we do not, I think your question sort of suggests that we sort of pick sides. We can't pick sides in this. We need to work with both Shia and Sunni states in the Middle East to identify solutions that will bring a lasting peace. I mean, that's a large, somewhat, aspirational answer to your question, but I think that is where our interests are, fundamentally founded.
Anyone else on Iran? No. Okay, great. Why don't we go, sir, on the aisle, and then ma'am in the red shirt behind.
Thank you. Michael Ryan with Jamestown Foundation. I wanted to ask if there are any practical ways that one can approach this issue of values. There's another strategic way to look at values. I recall a conversation after President Trump had first been elected but hadn't taken office. A former intelligence official in the greater Middle East, we won't identify him, asked me at a social event, how, if these values are out of the conversation, is the United States any different from China? That was his words. So why should anyone be attracted to the United States as an alternative? Okay, it's easy to say these kinds of things, but how in the current environment are there practical things that individuals or organizations can do to continue to project the values that people recognize traditionally with the United States, whether we live up to them all the time or not? Of course we don't. But it's an open-ended question. But the problem is, it's easy for us to say these things, but it's hard to see how you use the strategic value of our values, if you will, in any practical way.
I'll give a quick answer because I talked about this, and you know, I think every time we talk about a practical problem, you know, we should use as the touchstone for how we think about it our values. So I think the answer to your question is a very practical. One thing that comes to mind is a concrete consequence of not, you know, not sort of using our values as our touchstone for our policies is our relationships with our allies. And you can imagine, into your question, that, you know, countries that are critical, particularly the United Kingdom, other European allies, when we talk about, you know, repopulating Guantanamo or killing families of terrorists, you know, and not abiding by international norms in that regard, bringing back torture. I mean, these are, our allies are going to, you know, are going to run for the hills, and obviously that is a strategic problem for us if we cannot count on those allies in the overall counterterrorism fight. So that's one concrete way in which I think about it. The other way is the value, and this I didn't talk about, but the value, which I think is fundamentally an American or Western value, and that is a fact-based decision making. And when you hear the administration talk about, you know, really sort of the degrading way in which the administration talked about the intelligence community and has treated the intelligence community, there's real concern about whether or not decisions and policies are being made based on the facts that the intelligence community is you know, spending every day putting before policymakers. So, you know, again, that's a concrete way, I think, in answer to your question, that we need to be very concerned about getting away from those values and how they would have, you know, negative consequences for the effort.
Can I just add a short thing? Yep. I would go back to what I was saying about the Syrian refugees. You know, how many Syrians have died in this war? 400,000, something like that? The figures are somewhere in that range. And how many Americans have died from terrorist attacks since September 11th? Every one of them a tragedy, every terrorist attack a horrible event. But nonetheless, in perspective, it's been about, what, 100? So we need to be vigilant when it comes to counterterrorism, but counterterrorism also depends upon the degree to which we not just talk about ourselves and make this only about our own benefit, but also act as a leader to the rest of the world.
I would say I come from the human rights and democracy world. Although I work for the DoD now, I used to work for the National Democratic Institute, and before that the International Republican Institute, and before that I was a Peace Corps volunteer. So, for 10 years I focused on the values aspect of it. And American values are a paradox because on the one hand we're a democratic liberal society, and I think that's what most of us take a great pride in as citizenry. On the other hand, we're the most powerful military force in the world, and we are willing to leverage that military force to our own beneficial means and ends. We've seen this time and time again. I can remember in the weeks following the Snowden releases that I was traveling around working in different countries around the world, and human rights activists were turning down meetings with us. And this was, you know, because they didn't understand the paradox of values. I then sat down with, you know, some members of the IC, and they said, what do you expect? There are times when you have to, you know, carry the stick, and there are times when you have to, you know, do the softer side of things. I think the thing that we're seeing now is that we're seeing, instead of just carrying the big stick, we are talking about carrying the big stick and talking less about our values as a society. And that can be quite dangerous in a lot of ways, because it can lead to the perceptions that we seek to be a strong hegemonic type power, whether we say America first or not or anything else, saying that we're going to, potentially attack other countries or other types of things carries with it. I mean, everybody knows that we have the capability to do these things. Do we really have to tell other countries that we can do these things? Or is it more prudent to insinuate that, yeah, we have enormous capabilities, but our heart and our values and our society lies in something more robust. And in saying that and in developing that, we solve many problems that we would address with a lot of the other previous questions as well. And I think that that's going to continue to pose a challenge for this administration. And it's going to, they are addressing that slowly, I think. And I think that they'll come to realize it more in the coming years.
I think there's a very pithy statement attributed to General Mattis from his time as CENTCOM commander that if you gut the State Department, you're going to need to buy me a lot more ammunition. And I think that's a very concise way of communicating the idea. The woman in red in the back, please.
Hello, thank you all for speaking. That last answer was particularly relevant to my question, so I think it's a great lead-in. My question for you all is, how do you see the relationship between human rights, particularly religious freedom, and counterterrorism and countering violent extremism evolving? How do you see it changing? How do you see it continuing? Particularly in the face of violent extremism that's often portrayed as religious or sectarian conflict. I also forgot to introduce myself. My name is Emma, and I'm a student at the George Washington University. Thank you.
I'll give a quick answer. I mean, because I just, the immediate thing that comes to mind in response to your question is that the value, the idea of religious freedom is completely consistent with how we approach counterterrorism, and particularly the countering violent extremism effort in this country that Nick talked about, which has gained steam and did gain steam at the end of the Obama administration. I think important question to put on the table is where that goes under this administration. But the idea that that this is not a battle over religion, that when we bring awareness to communities in the United States about the way ISIS recruits and the messaging, and we seek to counter that message, that's not the United States imposing a any sort of religious restriction or religious test or advancing a particular religious view. It's an effort to inform people who may be susceptible to the message of Al-Qaeda or ISIS, how to understand that message and how to resist it, and also for us to be better positioned to identify people who have been, who have found that message attractive and perhaps have been mobilized to carry out an attack. So I think those two things are completely consistent. In other words, religious freedom in this country and the way we think about the counterterrorism problem, and in particular the countering violent extremism challenge.
Let me really quickly add to that. I think that there's a very large problem in American psyche that we equate terrorism and Islamic Jihad or Islam or Muslims in general. The history of terrorism is extremely long and extremely robust. And the vast majority of terrorists in the history of the world were not religious. They were either political or something else. And quite frankly, the fact of the matter is that ISIS and others are quite weak religiously. Al-Qaeda is much more robust on the religious side, and they were historically more robust. But ISIS and others are very weak. If you go back, Dr. Bruce Hoffman at Georgetown has a fantastic book that charts a lot of the history of terrorism and stuff like that. And you can go back into Russian anarchic terrorists and others and things along those lines. But if instead of focusing on the religious aspects of it, we focus on the political goals of terrorism, whether they're rational in our context or not, that's where you start making headway. When you start focusing on a religion, whether it be a domestic extremism in the United States or a foreign religion in another country, that's where you start running into significant problems, and you start, if anything, you start metastasizing the organizations as a whole. And so, human rights we should not attack religions. We should attack terrorists.
I agree. Yeah.
Good morning. Yaya Fanusi, Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Center on Sanctions and Illicit Finance. A bit of a, maybe a technical question. I'm wondering if, and probably for the two Aarons, wondering if you can say a little bit about propaganda, and can you give us a sense of what is, particularly with jihadists, what is their sentiment about how well their propaganda platforms are operating? Because we know, we talked about social media earlier, there's this cat and mouse game of closing accounts, taking down videos, YouTube, and the like. One of the things I'm interested in is technology and innovation, and there are innovations out there that go to this decentralized platforms, right? Using, promoting content that is not centralized. And this is sort of maybe something very nascent, but it's something that I'm thinking about. So one, are jihadists, are they happy with how they're getting their propaganda out? Maybe they don't need to find new platforms. Or two, should we be concerned about decentralized platforms and how this could be used by terrorists?
I think right now, if you look at the way that they're putting out content, it's pretty stable now. Telegram is the main platform that they use to put out the content. Of course, it's not as open or as good in terms of being able to use it as a larger megaphone and force multiplier to a broader audience than Twitter was. Twitter was by far the best place to go. But Twitter isn't really a location that they can operate openly. It's very hostile now. That's not to say that jihadists aren't on Twitter. They certainly are, but especially with ISIS in particular, those accounts get taken down within an hour, if not 24 hours at the latest. So I think that in terms of putting the content out, it's definitely the same as it's always been. There's an ability to do it. Telegram's been relatively stable. While there have been accounts taken down, it's slowed down their efforts more recently for whatever reason. But when you look at the recruitment, back to what Aaron was saying in his opening remarks, I do think that that's probably been hindered in some ways because Telegram isn't an open system which allows random people to just happen across the content, and therefore, you know, not everybody that sees something is going to be interested, but if it piques somebody's interest out of maybe 10,000 people, that's one more person you would have had that you didn't have otherwise. So it makes it more difficult because Telegram is more of a semi-open system versus Twitter, which is a fully open system. Of course, if Telegram actually is serious and starts taking down accounts and it's consistent over months and months of time, they'll probably innovate in the same way as before. I mean, we already saw this when they're primarily on password-protected forums, and that really got degraded in 2011, 2012, 2013, and that's when you really started to see them go onto Twitter. And then the same thing happened with Twitter in 2015, and that's when they went really to Telegram. What the alternative would be, it's hard to say right now because Telegram is unique in that it provides a broadcast which has just an open message to anybody that follows the account, but then also has the ability to have private conversations on the side. So you're allowed to do those two things at the same time if needed. Whereas a lot of the other messaging applications, it's just messaging between two people. There isn't necessarily this broadcast type feature. So the question is whether there would be something to fill the gap. Of course, I'm not in a technology company or any startup, so I'm sure there's possibly some other smaller company that might be out there that could fill this vacuum, but I can't point to anything specific right now.
So just really quick, my colleagues at the CTC have released a report that tracks the proliferation of propaganda and media over the, not just within social media, but general news releases from the state, the Islamic State. And they've tracked, Dan Milton and Mohammed Al-Baidi have tracked a precipitous decline as the physical geographic locations have been constrained. The volume of production has decreased as well, mostly due to stress on the media platform development. So I don't know if anybody here studies the IS very, very robustly, but they have a very robust bureaucratic structure. They keep track of everybody who inflows into their organization. They basically write up a resume. It's kind of like going into your job. NBC News released a report a while back on this with us, and you can see their full media structure. And in fact, they adopted an Al-Qaeda media structure after our withdrawal from Iraq and others. And so as that physical structure is constrained, it then forces it into the decentralized structure of the of internet and cyberspace writ large. The problem with that is on the internet, nobody knows that you're a dog. And so when you go between platforms, so I meet you in a Telegram chat room or something like that, and I go into a private communications with you, what we've seen is that, hey, you want to grab a cup of coffee and plan an attack. Well, that person's most likely not going to be your jihadist buddy. That's probably going to be an FBI agent. And so, there's a problem with trust. And so this is how do you verify? So then you switch back into human networks. So my brother's sister's cousin's nephew knows me and he can vouch for me. Now let's go into the private chat room and start working on something else.
I think we'll take 2 more questions together, unfortunately, and then call it a wrap. So, sir in the uniform, and then one other in the middle, white shirt and tie, whose color I can't see.
This question's for Dr. Cronin. Wanted to seize on your discussion about the lack of strategy right now for the region, which leads to kind of murkiness for CT strategy. What is the proper strategy for the Middle East for an administration without strategic patience?
Okay, I teach a course on this. You can come by my office. This would take probably a semester to discuss. I would say that fundamentally, we need to think about what American interests are, independent of how we are responding to the reactive provocations that we're receiving. And so that means that even though we are facing a foreign fighter problem that's going to transition throughout the world, as I argued, we have to think harder about what parts of the world are more important, what parts of the world are less important to our interests, and not just where we have to respond to individual operatives that may or may not have us on their hit list. So that's the first thing I would say. When it comes to strategy in the Middle East, we're not taking a realistic interest-based approach. I think we're reacting largely to events that have occurred for reasons that I fully understand and actually supported when it comes to the use of military operations against ISIS. But in the broader sense, we don't seem to be able to articulate what the outcome, what the end state should be. If the end state is stability in the Middle East, then we're going to have to make some very, very difficult decisions about who we're going to have in charge that may or may not suit our values and our interests. And I would leave that to the person who's currently writing the strategy for the United States. But the key exhibit is the future of Assad, I would say.
Great. And sir, for the final question.
Thank you for being here. I'm Hugo Kurth with the Charles Koch Institute. One thing we haven't heard a lot about today is the phenomenon of blowback. And given the stated aims and motivations of many of the people and organizations committing terrorist attacks, what leads you to believe that U.S. military presence and campaigns in the region are actually making the problem better rather than worse? Thanks.
I'll start, and I'm sure others will have much more interesting things to say. But following on what I just argued, I've been saying for some years now that we are not necessarily improving our position by responding primarily and overwhelmingly with expensive military force. And instead, we need to prioritize where we respond, because we're actually drawing more of the attention of some of our enemies toward targeting the United States. I think it is a delicate balance, and part of hitting that balance correctly is to have very robust homeland security. There's no question. But unless we have good development assistance, diplomacy, and all of the other mechanisms of policy, we're going to continue to make this mistake over and over again at great expense and at poor outcomes.
Very quickly, I really agree with the points you've made, and including your initial points, Audrey, about the military response is part of the response, but it can't be the whole response, and we need to prioritize where we are taking military action with respect to counterterrorism. I do think, in response to your question, that we've been quite effective at really almost completely degrading the core of al-Qaeda leadership in Pakistan, and we've used significant pressure to do that, and that I think is a significant example of effective use of American power. I think the same goes with largely with respect to the military air campaign and our leadership in Syria and the impact that's had on the Islamic State. So I do think there are good examples. I don't think those are examples that reflect a blowback where the costs outweigh the benefits. I think the benefit of our exertion of significant military force there was the right thing to do. So, but it needs to be in conjunction with a broader strategy that, to Secretary Mattis's point, we need to we need to fully fund the rest of our efforts, whether it's diplomatic, intelligence, or law enforcement.
Well, please thank me, everyone, in thanking Matt and Audrey and Aaron. And thank you all for coming.